Way to go, Tom.
I should have known that would happen. Are we good?
I guess.
A little lower? Okay. Very good. Go ahead and open your Bibles to the book of Proverbs this morning. In the beginning, there was work. Now, you might not have expected to hear that last part coming after that first part, but nevertheless, it's true. In the beginning, there was work. And work was actually very good. God gave mankind work to do at the very beginning. In fact, interestingly enough, and if you read the Genesis account closely, God gave man work before he gave man woman. Now there's room for a joke right there, but I'm not gonna take that opportunity. But God gave man work before he gave man human companionship. But what was work for? Common amongst the ancient Near Eastern creation myths, which were so prevalent during the time of Moses and the early national life of Israel, was the idea that the gods gave mankind work in order to relieve themselves of actually having to do it themselves. The gods didn't enjoy all of the work that was necessary in order to sustain the world. And so they offloaded those responsibilities to humanity. And therefore, man was burdened with the arduous task of having to sustain the world and to make something of the world so that the gods could take their rest and enjoy their leisure. But the Hebrew Scriptures give us an entirely different perspective on human labor. And yes, it's true, in the beginning there was work. But work wasn't given in order to offload the Creator's responsibility onto humankind. Rather, work was given as a channel by which man, whom the Bible says was created in the image of God, could effectively represent God as an image bearer by reproducing exactly the types of activities that his God engaged in, just on a bit of a smaller scale. You see, the God of the Bible is portrayed as a working God. The entire first chapter of the very first book of the Bible details the work that our God performed in order to bring our world into existence. And so creating us, mankind, in his image, you and I reflect that image within us through, among other things, the work that you and I do and the dominion that we exercise over the earth as we labor. But as the biblical narrative unfolds, we see that humankind stains his existence, or mankind rather, stains his own existence by choosing to usurp the original hierarchy established by God in the garden, and by choosing to appoint himself as his own God. And with that rebellious decision, man plunged himself into sinful ruin, and that brought about the curse of God upon all creation and upon all human endeavor, including the human endeavor of work. From that moment on in the garden, we can read about this in Genesis chapter 3. From that moment on, work was made toilsome. It was made aggravating. It was made unpleasant. Now, human work required sweat and exertion. It required pain and drudgery, risk and failure. But even mankind's approach to work was corrupted and distorted. Over the course of time, humans began to resist the requirements of work through sloth and through laziness. Other human beings decided to use work as a tool of oppression and manipulation. But we also see in that early account of man's existence that God embarked upon a mission of redemption and reconciliation. And that mission of redemption and reconciliation took within itself all of those aspects of our humanity which were cursed and corrupted by our original acts of sin. And within that train, God took up human labor as well. When we turn in our Bibles to the New Testament, we see that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, is sent to reverse all of the effects of that original curse. And within that comprehensive purpose of Jesus, Jesus also returned labor to its original meaning and significance before God. But within that unfolding process, we see God leading his people with wisdom by which they can approach their work and engage in work for the glory of he whose image they bear, and also for their enjoyment of the process. God has left us with wisdom by which to work and to work so as to image him as we do so. One figure that God uses in the book of Proverbs to teach us wisdom in work, to show us how to work wisely, is the character of the sluggard. Now, the sluggard is mentioned no less than 14 times in the book of Proverbs. That makes him one of the most prominent figures. How's that? Still out? Are we good? Okay. Just do that a couple more times to make sure everybody's paying attention. Later on. Space it out. Space it out. Because that will not be distracting at all. The sluggard is one of the most prominent figures in the wisdom literature of the Bible, but he's not prominent for anything good. The sluggard is prominent because of what his life illustrates in terms of what not to do with our skills, what not to do with our resources, and what not to do with our opportunities. And if you haven't figured it out through your reading of the Bible, God chooses to teach his people very often through figures like the sluggard. Because sometimes, because of our innate biases that always cast ourselves in the most favorable light, because of those biases, we're unable to see the flaws and the imperfections in our own character and behavior unless we first see it in somebody else. And in addition to that, because our individual perspectives almost always start with us looking out and seldom with us looking back in to ourselves, we typically see the failings and shortcomings in other people before we recognize them in ourselves. So God uses the figure of the sluggard to help us see past our own biases and become aware of our internal blind spots within which we hide so many of our personality and behavioral flaws. Ladies and gentlemen, if we're never taken outside ourselves in order to look more closely, in order to look more critically at ourselves, then you and I will be destined to live at the mercy of those very same biases and blind spots. And God knows that that poses a tremendous spiritual stumbling block. And so he teaches us through figures like the sluggard. So look to the sluggard right now. And in Proverbs chapter 6, God is admonishing the sluggard to look to the ant. Now, in terms of the Bible, the sluggard is simply the lazy, indolent person. In fact, the actual Hebrew can be accurately rendered with the more comical expression, lazy bones. The sluggard is the lazy bones who avoids work and exertion at all costs. In fact, the literature of the Proverbs presents him as being so slothful, so lazy, that he won't even cook his own food. He's also so averse to expending any effort that once he sticks his hand there in the food dish, he counts it too much trouble to lift it back up to his face. So he just lets it sit there for a while. So the sluggard is exhorted to look at the ant. Consider the ant's ways. Gain wisdom from the ant. Of course, the implication there is that the sluggard, as a sluggish, lazy person, is not yet wise with the wisdom of God. And what is that wisdom of God that he or she can gain from the ant? Well, it's there in verses 7 through 8. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food at harvest. The ant, according to that explanation, takes initiative for its own needs, and the sluggard, by implication, doesn't. The ant doesn't wait upon some other breed of ant or some other animal to come along and provide for its needs, but the sluggard, by implication, does. And the ant doesn't wait for some taskmaster to make it get up and go out and to secure what it needs. There is no chief, no officer, no ruler to command and coerce the ant to do something about its needs. The ant is wise enough to know that it has a need, and is wise enough to know that if it doesn't work to get them, that it may not ever have them satisfied. And yet at the same time, the sluggard has to be coaxed out of bed and questioned as to how long he plans to stay there until he gets up. Just look at verse 9. Look at what it says. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? And the sluggard replies in accord with his nature, just a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands. Notice there, he doesn't offer a full-fledged refusal. And that's because I'm convinced that most sluggards know that they need to work, but they simply don't want to. But they also know that not wanting to is never really that great of an excuse by itself. And usually to answer that way, to answer that honestly, runs the risk of casting them in a negative light. So they just ask for a little more time to go about their nothingness, just a little more rest. Just a little more sleep. Just a little more Xbox 360. Just a little more Netflix. Just a little more Facebook. Just a little more Twitter. Just a little more internet, please. And yet in other instances, the sluggard is content to just make up some fanciful excuses to get out of hard labor. For instance, in Proverbs 22, the sluggard says, "There's a lion outside. I should be killed if I go out into the streets." And so he stays at home clutching that paper-thin excuse, as if it should just be so plainly obvious to everybody. And obviously, if you don't see it that way, then you must be crazy. There's a lion out there somewhere. And he might have heard us if we go out. I think we'll just stay inside today. But unlike the ant, who's going to have plenty of food, plenty of resources stored up for the bad times, the sluggard is going to find himself quickly overtaken with poverty, just like a robber or an armed man comes upon their victims with deception and speed. According to that text, the wisdom of the sluggard is steeped in self-deception. He believes his own excuses. "I'll get to it," he says, as he rolls over in his bed again. And interestingly, Proverbs 16 says, as a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. The sluggard believes his own spin. He believes his own propaganda. No one can deceive the sluggard better than himself. And once he's bought into his own spin, he's past the point of reason. In fact, Proverbs 26, verse 16 says, "The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly." In addition, as we go through that passage, we see that the ant works while there's still plenty of time before winter comes on. It does not wait until the last moment to do what it needs to do for food and provision. Now, not all ants act that way. But the ants in Solomon's land, Solomon was the writer responsible for this material, the ants in Palestine did do that. In fact, on the threshing floors of many of the Palestinian granaries, if you look closely enough, you'll see paths which have been etched out in the dust, where the ants have been busy gathering and collecting for winter. So in the summer and at harvest time, the ant prepares its food. It gathers and stores away for the future, anticipating times when it will simply be too difficult to get out. So the wisdom that God has deposited with the ant instructs that honest seeker of God's wisdom that to work wisely is to work with initiative, it is to work with foresight, it is to work with diligence, and yet there stands the sluggard, the epitome of unwise work. He doesn't plan. He doesn't consider how his actions now will impact his future later. He procrastinates. In fact, he's prone to making the greatest effort in his life at simply avoiding real work. Charles Spurgeon once said, "He, that is, the sluggard, takes great pains to escape from pains." Now, as I was thinking about this lesson, my mind drifted back to one of my most favorite television shows of all time, and a particular clip from that show that I think illustrates this tendency of the sluggard so well. Now, just to set the table for you, the show is Seinfeld. Anybody know about Seinfeld? And the sluggard is George Costanza. And in this clip, George he's been out of work for a long time. And so, in order to retain his benefits at the unemployment office, he has to go there periodically, check in with the unemployment officer, and at least prove that he's trying to find work. And so long as he has proved that he's trying to find a job, then they'll continue to extend his unemployment benefits. So that's where he's at right now. So watch this clip just for a few moments.
Sit at a desk, pushing papers around, you can forget it. That was Keith. We're going to do something next week.
Yellow. What delay industries? Way off. Well, yeah, that's the right number, but this is an apartment.
And you want to be my latex set.
He takes great pains in order to escape pains. That's the sluggard. One day, Solomon was out taking a ride. He was taking care of some business. We're not told what business it was. And he passed a certain estate. And he didn't know the person who lived at that estate, but based upon what he saw, he knew what type of person lived there. He instantly gained insight into the manner of life that that person had lived up until that moment, and he could predict with reasonable certainty what type of life that person was going to go on living if they did not intersect with the wisdom of God. In fact, so impacted by what Solomon saw, he wrote it down. And it became the basis of a proverb, and quite likely the basis of all other proverbs that Solomon ever wrote about sluggards. That comes in the second reading that we had this morning in Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 34, where he says, I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles. That simply means artichokes or weeds. And its stone walls broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. There's something that God wants every sluggard to know and every seeker of His wisdom to know. God has ordained severe consequences for the lazy, sluggish person. If you're a sluggard, then God is going to interact with you in a certain way. First, He's going to direct what happens in your life as a result of your laziness. He's going to direct you into certain consequences of your work ethic. And then He's going to instruct His people about how to deal with you when they come into contact with you. Now, in terms of the consequences that God is going to visit upon people like this, our text in Proverbs chapter 6 says that poverty will come upon you like a robber, like an armed man. Proverbs 10 says that a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Proverbs 19:15 says an idle person will suffer hunger. So basically, God is promising that He's going to direct that person's life into a life of poverty as the just rewards of that individual's work ethic. And that's the case because the human being made in God's image is not imaging God by being idle, being lazy, being sluggish. And so God's never going to reward that form of life. He's never going to bless that lifestyle. Instead, He'll curse it. Just like He cursed the rebellion in Eden, He will curse the rebellion of sluggishness. He'll let poverty overtake the person unwilling to work. And He'll let their own desires, their own yearnings, eat them alive on the inside as they sit idly by, refusing to do what it takes to satisfy those desires. Proverbs 21, verses 25 through 26 says, the desire of the sluggard kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. All day long he craves and craves, but the righteous gives and doesn't hold back. Ultimately, the sluggard is going to look back on his life with regret and unfulfilled ambitions. He's going to look back and he's going to see wasted opportunities. He's going to see regular failures. He's going to see disappointment, unsatisfied desires. He's going to see those areas of his life where things like a job and steady income and life stability would have provided and would have satisfied for those things. But he or she is never going to be able to experience any of that. He'll frequently want, and he'll seldom actually have. As Proverbs 13:4 notes, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. Ladies and gentlemen, sluggards don't change the world. Sluggards don't impact those around them. No one admires a sluggard. No one wants to imitate a sluggard. There's no future in sluggishness. And this is why students, college, high school, middle school, this is why there's nothing funny, and this is why there's nothing cute about regularly making C's and D's because you failed or forgotten to prepare for tests or assignments. There's nothing cute or funny about sluggishness. This is why, husbands, there's nothing manly and there's nothing honorable about letting your house fall apart, about letting the weeds grow up in your yard, and about letting your wife's car sit in the driveway with a flat tire and needing an oil change. There's nothing honorable and there's nothing manly about that. And that's why, ladies, there's nothing noble about letting the dirt and the grime pile up within your house and letting your children go to school with dirty, unwashed clothes. No one admires the sluggard. There's no reward to sluggishness. And God will let the full consequences of that life fall back in all of its force upon that individual. Now, that being said, God gives his people wisdom with reference to how to act towards those types of individuals. And the main piece of wisdom that he gives is never to so act towards the sluggard as to enable them in their sluggardliness. I don't know if that's a word, but I made it work right there. Never reward the sluggard by enabling them to be sluggish. When you do that, you're only undermining God's purpose for that person's life. And you're only further damaging the sluggard when you enable them to stay sluggardly. You know, under the Old Covenant in Solomon's day, benevolence was generally reserved for the deserving working poor. One instance of that was in the case of Ruth, one of the descendants of, or rather, I guess you could say the ascendants of Jesus. She was instrumental in his family line. But but in Ruth's situation, she was very poor. But every day, according to Ruth chapter 2, she would go out to the grain fields and she would glean what the harvesters left behind. And once Boaz, the man who owned that particular field, noted how diligent she was, he started to instruct his workers to leave behind a little more, so that this woman could come behind and glean more. It's interesting, he didn't tell them to just cut some sheaves and go take it to her house. He told them just leave a little bit more on the ground. And when she comes to do her daily work, she'll actually be rewarded a little bit more for that effort. So we don't enable the sluggard to remain sluggish. You know, even in the New Testament, under the new covenant of Jesus Christ, we find an instruction that goes like this. Paul says, "For even when we were with you, we would give you this command. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busy bodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living." That's 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 10 through 12. So Christians are not to enable sloth and sluggishness in the way that they treat others who may be prone to slothfulness and sluggishness. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, among other things, that God does not expect his children to aid and abet that one friend of ours who is completely healthy, but who can't seem to hold down a job, or can't seem to get a job, but who also regularly hits us up for cash. That means that God doesn't expect Christian parents to confirm their adult children in his or her laziness by continuing to provide food, clothing, and shelter without requiring them to work. And that means that God's church is not obligated to extend benevolence to those in the community who are poor, not because their jobs just don't pay all the bills, but who are poor because they choose not to have jobs. In God's wisdom, the Lord tells us that the best that we can do for that type of person is to actually allow them to face the consequences of that work ethic until they finally see the wisdom, until they finally see God's wisdom in diligent, earnest, honest labor. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. So God's wise worker can take his cues from the wisdom that God has placed in the care of ants. Consider her ways and be wise. Friends, drop a crumb of food on the ground near a colony of ants and watch how quickly they spring into action in order to capture that morsel of food and carry off the prize to the rest of the colony. Friends, the only ant that you'll ever see standing still is a dead ant. A live ant is moving. It's active. It's working. It is contributing. It's self-motivated. It doesn't require a supervisor to hover over it to make sure that it's working. The ant doesn't have a chief, a ruler, an officer to command or threaten. The ant prepares its bread in summer, gathers its food in harvest because it knows that the future is coming, and the needs of the future are going to look a lot like the needs of the right now. Now, I can't leave this subject without considering what Jesus did, what he taught, how he redeemed human labor. Jesus came and he affirmed God's constant work ethic as well as his own. In John chapter 5, verse 17, he told his fellow Jews, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." According to Jesus, God is a working God, and humanity images their Creator God by also filling our time with work. In Paul's letters, he takes the teaching of the life of Jesus and applies it to his servants in their serving of other people. In Colossians, he says to servants, which parallels our modern-day employee, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong that he's done, and there is no partiality. Friends, the worker must work sincerely, not just when the right people are watching. He must work out of the reverence of God as if he's working for God himself. He must remember that it is from the Lord that he'll receive his reward, even his reward for good, honest work. And he must remember that as a disciple of Jesus, he is serving the Lord in everything he does, including his work. And he also must remember that for any shortcuts, any abuses that he takes as a worker will be paid back for the wrong that he's done, and there is no partiality. Friends, our work is good, it is profitable, and it is full of joy only when we exercise it under the lordship of God and his Messiah. Our successes shouldn't fuel our pride, our egotism. Rather, our successes should fuel our humility as we acknowledge that all of those successes are entirely dependent upon God's blessings. We honor God with our labor, and God is pleased to reward us for our work. Proverbs 10:4 says, "The hand of the diligent makes rich," and Proverbs 12:24 says that the hand of the diligent will rule. But at the same time, our work mustn't become an idol. There's a danger for the one who's successful at work. Work can become all-consuming for us. And anything that's all-consuming for us is called idolatry in the Bible. Assuming that that which is all-consuming is not God. So we mustn't put career ahead of Jesus. Friends, our careers are a pale and sickly substitute for our relationship with God. And that's the fine line to be walked by the diligent disciple. And at the the same time, while work is important, it isn't to consume all of our time. From the very beginning, God has been concerned with regulating the periods of work and rest of his people. In the Old Testament, it was the Sabbath day. In the New, it's Jesus himself who offers rest to those seeking true satisfaction. And he even offers an eternal Sabbath, which will give us an eternal rest. An eternal rest, not where we will be idle and inactive, but an eternal rest where all that we do will be satisfied, fulfilling, and lasting. The Hebrews author compared the rest that God gave the Israelites in the Old Testament to the rest that Jesus gives to his followers. He said, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest, he also rests from his works as God did from his." So Jesus offers rest to the weary soul today by removing the burden of your sin by the sacrifice of himself, by appeasing the wrath of God for your sins by his own self-giving sacrifice. He bore our deserved condemnation, but he resurrected from the grave, thereby blazing the path to the promised land, the pathway to the ultimate eternal rest for the people of God. So we call upon you to claim him as Lord today. Be immersed into his life as we all stand and sing this next song.
660.
All to Jesus I surrender, all to him I freely give. I will ever love and trust in his presence daily live. I surrender
Hopefully you found things pleasing and edifying members. I hope that the lesson has been applicable to you, and let's do our best to live out the teachings and the implications of some of the things that we talked about this morning. Hold on just a moment.